Hello and welcome to the next installment in the Law & Order video series, where we look at and unpack stories from games. In this one, we'll be looking into the story from House of Ashes, the third installment of the Dark Pictures Anthology. After Man of Medan and Little Hope divided opinion on the threat not being real, this one actually delivered a real threat. I can't believe I have to say this on a Story Explained video, but there will be spoilers in this one. Ready? Then let's go. Akkad, Sumeria 2231 BC. A man referred to as a Gutian is being beaten by a man adorned with armour and exclaims that he doesn't want to die. The man doing the beating is called away as he's been summoned by the king. We find out that he is a general, and a guard warns the general that the king's madness has cursed the temple and all their people. The general responds and says that he'd rather die in a cursed temple than die to what seems to be a plague and famine happening outside in Akkad. Appearing before the king, a woman is on her knees. Another Gutian. The general enters the temple, inside which a bright ray of sunlight is beaming through what seems to be a purpose-built hole in the roof, shining on the throne. The king mentions to the woman that the moon god sent her people to destroy his kingdom, and he warns the general that the moon god has sent the Gutian army to destroy them. The king refers to the hundreds of prisoners below, and the general responds by saying these sacrifices will take time, but the king says that the sacrifice will be fulfilled. He gestures to the woman on the ground, stating that she will be the first sacrifice. A struggle occurs and the woman runs off, but the general ends up killing her, throwing her head onto the altar in front of the king. The Gutian being beaten before is now thrown into a cell. He manages to fight back, kill the guard, and escape from his cell. The king sits upon his throne looking up at the sun shining through the hole in the roof. Meanwhile, the general has gathered the Akkadian forces at the entrance to the temple to defend it from the Gutians, and a battle ensues. All of a sudden, an eclipse occurs. Something happens. In the depths of the temple, monstrous shrieks can be heard. The Gutian prisoner makes his way to the temple to confront his enemies, but finds them all dead. All of a sudden, the general, being chased by something, tries to barricade the door shut, but sensing a moment of vulnerability, the Gutian tries to attack the Akkadian general. He holds him off and manages to convince him to help him hold the door shut. The general mentions that the king has cursed them all and says that the Akkadians thought the Gutians were the demons who brought plague and famine, but the general now realises that they were wrong. The two enemies team up to try and escape the temple through the catacombs. They don't get very far, however, as what seems to be a horrifying creature confronts them and kills them both. Fast forward thousands of years later to 2003. US Marines have set up a base in the southeastern corner of Baghdad International Airport and called it Camp Slayer. This base was previously a presidential resort for Saddam Hussein, who had gone into hiding after the fall of Baghdad the month before. First Lieutenant Jason Kolchak of the US Marine Force Recon salutes Lieutenant Colonel Eric King of the US Air Force onto their makeshift base. He is accompanied by his assistant, Dr. Clarice Stokes. After apologising for being early, he presents an order stating that he'll be assuming command of their operation, and they head to the briefing room, along the way meeting other team members Joey and Merwin. Lieutenant Kolchak mentions that their current CO, who he refers to as the Queen Bitch, will not be happy about Eric taking over. The twist is a strange wife, Rachel, a CIA field officer, is the team's current commanding officer, so that's awkward. Anyway, we see Rachel making out in her office with a US Marine called Sergeant Nick Kay. She gets a call stating that her husband has arrived early, and she tells Nick to get dressed. He mentions to her that Rachel and her husband have been apart for a year now, and that she should just tell Eric about them, but she says it's not the right time. Nick then leaves the room and Rachel picks up his lighter and puts it in her pocket. In the briefing room, Eric finds a paper dated May 2nd, 2003, which states that President Bush has declared the end of hostilities in Iraq. It also states that despite this, US forces remain in the country in order to search for WMDs. Eric and Rachel reunite after a year, and after a frosty chat, Rachel is informed by Eric that he has taken command of their operation. She initially doesn't believe him, so Jason presents Rachel with the order confirming this. Eric gives his presentation and his briefing and tells the team that his highly classified Kalis program, which is a thermal satellite, has picked up a possible location of WMDs right on the border of Iraq and Iran. Some of the team express concerns that the border is a dangerous place. Nevertheless, Eric mentions that they have a responsibility to ensure that Saddam can't use these WMDs to hurt people. Eric and Rachel talk, and she says that their relationship is over, but she doesn't tell him about Nick. They then leave for the helos. The focus then turns to an Iraqi soldier named Salim, a lieutenant in the Republican Guard. He is carrying a gift and returns home to look for his son Zain. Zane is not at home, but Salim finds a box of stolen goods underneath his bed and calls his neighbour to find out where his son is. At that moment, his commanding officer, Captain Basri, turns up and informs him that the Americans are flying in and they need to go and intercept them. Salim informs his captain that the war is over and they lost. Basri informs Salim that there has been no surrender and they still need to defend their land. Flying over the Zagros Mountains, the team lands, but instead of finding an entrance to an underground facility and WMDs, they find a stash of heroin. It appears that Eric's satellite made an error and picked up a bunch of crooks producing heroin instead. All of a sudden, a helicopter is hit by a rocket and goes down, slamming into the ground, and the team find themselves under fire from Iraqi forces. Joey is hit and is bleeding out, and despite Nick trying to save him, he dies in his arms. Jason comes face to face with Salim and the two decide not to shoot each other, and then the ground gives way, likely due to the impact of the helicopter earlier, revealing the temple from thousands of years earlier, and the team, including Salim, fall into the depths below. Nick sees something leap out of the wall and disappear, but comes across it again later. Something seems to be down there with them. A visibly shaken Nick meets Jason and tries to explain to him what he saw, but Jason doesn't believe him. They hear screams coming from a tunnel and it's Merwin, who has been caught up in some wire and is in very bad shape, and Clarice is trying to help him. Jason and Nick attend to Merwin and tell Clarice to stand guard, and then she's dragged into the darkness by an unseen entity. All of a sudden, they hear shrieks and drag Merwin away. He's making too much noise whilst in pain though, so they inject him with morphine and it keeps him quiet, so they move out. Meanwhile, Salim dusts himself off, tries to radio his captain. He comes across a dead Marine with a look of pure terror on his face. Wondering what could have killed him so violently, Salim jumps, but he loses his gun and then ventures down a tunnel and finds the dead body of one of his teammates, which gets dragged into the abyss and then is thrown back at him. Salim grabs a nearby gun and shoots at the creature, which seems to do absolutely nothing. He runs for it and gets lucky when a truck falls from above and takes out the creature. Salim is jubilant and can't believe his own luck. Eric, waking from a dream about his wedding to Rachel, ventures down a tunnel with Rachel. They rappel down and find the ruins of the temple where the Arcadian general killed the Gutian woman. They have to fix a generator when the lights come up, and they find an old tape recorder which details a man talking with gunfire and people screaming in the background, and how they have thrown open the gates to madness. They talk about sealing this place for eternity. He appears to say sorry to someone named Mary and then shoots himself. Eric and Rachel hear a commotion, and it's Captain Basri, who is rappelling down, and he starts shooting at them, forcing them to flee. The temple then starts to shake and rumble, and Rachel falls. She hangs on, but Eric manages to throw an old rope to her, and she grabs on. However, Eric can't hold her for long, so either Rachel or Eric, depending on who you play as, have to cut the rope, causing Rachel to fall to the depths below. Jason and Nick, still dragging Merwin around, come across a visibly distraught Eric, who tells them that Rachel fell because he had to cut the rope. Jason tells Eric about the creatures, but he doesn't believe him. The lights go out. Nick and Jason go check it out, and Eric goes to guard Merwin. Nick and Jason get the generator going again as it looked to have been sabotaged. They follow tunnels and set up a choke point, planting explosives in order to trap the creatures if they come through. At that point though, they think they hear Joey in the tunnels. Obviously Nick says that's impossible, seeing as he died in his arms. Jason heads back to guard Merwin whilst Eric and Nick investigate. Meanwhile, Salim has another run-in with the creature he faced earlier on. He escapes it, but in the process realises that sunlight burns it. He kills the creature, staking it through the heart. Some Marines turn up, but are soon slaughtered by more creatures. Back with Eric and Nick, they find Joey's glasses and his earpiece, along with the first aid bag. They are attacked by Captain Basri, who throws a grenade after being shot in the shoulder by Nick, causing a cave-in, separating Eric and Nick. Nick is then approached by Salim, who warns him of a creature ahead and they must flank it in order to try and kill it. They succeed, and Salim surrenders as Nick's fellow soldiers approach, but Eric orders him captured. Tied up in the tent, Salim watches Eric perform an autopsy on the creature they killed. He notes the wings, which are attached to the hands of the creature. Nick and Jason, still securing the tunnels in case the creatures come through, find two corpses who appear to have died mysteriously and violently. Salim mentions their sensitivity to UV light, and Eric uses his ultraviolet light on it, and the creature burns up. Eric is distracted by someone running past the tent, and Salim takes the opportunity to escape. Rachel wakes up in a place called the Pit, which is filled with blood and corpses. Wading through, she encounters a statue of Pazuzu, which bears a striking resemblance to the creatures. She is being stalked by a creature which reveals itself, causing Rachel to run straight into a seemingly still alive Clarice, and the both of them escape. But it appears that Clarice is not well at all. They spot the same pagan symbol on the wall that they saw in the hut earlier on, and despite her illness, Clarice manages to climb on top of the chasm with Rachel. Rachel swings over to the other side, but Clarice chooses not to, as she appears to have accepted her fate. Out of nowhere, Jason is attacked by Joey, who is very much dead, and he appears to have turned into something. Jason stakes him through the heart with a sharp object he found earlier on, and as Joey falls to the depths, a shriek rings out. They find a radio which appears to have been sabotaged by someone. Merwin, miraculously recovered from his injuries, turns up to fix the radio. It lets out loud interference, causing the creatures to cry out even louder. Jason sends Eric to check on the cameras they set up in order to warn them of creatures coming, but is captured by Captain Basri. Merwin stops the noise and attempts to fix the radio, managing to do so, but then is shot and killed by Basri, who then engages in combat with the Marines. Nick attempts to radio for help and contacts their support. They confirm they will come and get them, but at that moment, Basri shoots and destroys the radio. Jason and Nick try to flank him, causing him to flee. They run themselves and are closing the doors when Rachel appears. She hugs Nick and then Eric, leading to tension and a brief fight, but they are interrupted by the creatures coming for them. The generator is dying and they are doomed without light, so they try to get it running again. They fight and manage to make their escape, but run into Basri and Salim. A standoff occurs and they all realise that in order to get out of this, they have to work together. They all fight with the creatures. Basri is wounded and killed, as is Rachel. But someone familiar turns up. It's Karum, or Balathu depending on your prologue, who appears to be the same kind of creature that Joey was, except he is thousands of years old. Nick is thrown down into the depths, but the rest escape and are separated. Later, Nick and an actually alive Rachel reunite and embrace, but Eric crashes the party. And again, another thing that's determinant on your playthrough, Rachel decides she wants to be with Eric again and they reconcile. Salim runs into Jason, and after a tense standoff they agree to work together. So they come across an area with a green glow emanating from it, and Jason finds an elevator, so they go down to check it out. They find what appears to be a city at 3,500 feet down and decide that they need to strike back at the creatures hunting them. Sneaking through what seems to be the many cocoons containing the creatures, Salim mentions that he can smell formaldehyde, and it appears that the liquid is preserving whatever it touches. They are ambushed by creatures, but are rescued by Nick, Rachel and Eric, who followed them down there. The five of them enter what appears to be a sort of star chamber, and Salim discovers that the creatures communicate with each other through music and sound. After activating a contraption, it seems that Rachel is suffering from an illness similar to the symptoms she witnessed Clarice displaying. Rachel seems to experience a vision of sorts, which shows a ship breaching the Earth's atmosphere above the deserts of the Middle East. Salim mentions a sickness which has turned the archaeologists into creatures. Rachel then lets out a scream and Salim mentions that she has it, a parasite inside her, causing the sickness which will eventually turn her into a monster. She attempts to kill herself with white phosphorus but can't go through with it. Salim mentions the preserving agent in the cocoons, so they decide as a last resort they're going to cocoon Rachel. However, Eric has a bright idea, which is to use his UV light to try and draw out the parasite. This works, and Rachel, rather graphically, ejects the parasite from her body and she kills it. Pushing on with their original plan, Nick plants explosives at the base of the cocoon mountain and blows it, causing the cocoons to set alight. They escape and are chased by creatures, but Salim is separated from them. Jason goes back for him and they fight together, and everyone does manage to escape via the elevator. With ropes to climb in order to fully escape the depths, and now fully turned Clarice attacks Eric and Rachel, but they manage to defeat her and everyone escapes to the surface. All is not over though, and after confirming that the pickup team is 5 minutes away, the unimaginable happens, an eclipse. Just like that in a card, causing the creatures to emerge from the ruins. The team have to retreat to their huts and fight for their lives while the eclipse finishes its cycle. They manage it with everyone surviving. The game ends. However, one last twist is that in the credits all the survivors are being interviewed, and it seems that people in charge don't want the information getting out. Anyway, that's the plot. A lot of things to talk about and look into here, so I guess let's start with Kur, or House of Ashes. We're going to have to dive into Mesopotamian mythology to understand what happened, so let's begin with what the Sumerians believed, which played a huge part in the narrative. Essentially being the earliest astronomers, the Sumerians believed that the sky was formed of a number of domes. They believed that the outermost dome housed the sky god An. They believed that the stars and the planets had their own gods. Utu was the sun god, Sin was the moon god. There are others, but their relevance to this story is nothing if not minimal. Now, one of the beliefs of the Akkadians is that the eclipse is a sign of disaster. They were literally terrified of them, which explains why everything seems to hit the fan when an eclipse occurs, and why Naram-Sin thought the moon god had cursed their land. They believed that in death, a soul could not travel upwards to the heavens due to the heavens being a place for the divine and not for mortal beings, so that soul was to be confined to earth. Upon death, the person's soul would then be led to the underworld known as Kur, which translates to House of Ashes. The only drink available to them would be dust, and they could only eat clay. Light did not exist down there, but only darkness. Good deeds did not make a difference. The only respite a soul would have depends on where they were buried. So for this reason, many dead were buried near their homes, and sacrifices of food and drink were made. For example, pouring wine into a dead person's grave would quench the thirst of their soul in Kur, the House of Ashes. As a result of this though, many wealthy people lived well in the House of Ashes, and many poor people, due to having a poor burial, would have a life of torment. Now on the flip side, if a person died and didn't get those luxuries, they as ghosts could bring about torment on the living. Mythology goes that the ruler of the Mesopotamian underworld was Ereshkigal, and the demons that lived in Kur were Lamashtu and Pazuzu. Now you Exorcist fans may have seen a lot of Pazuzu statues around the temple. So the game starts off in ancient Sumer in the year 2231 BC. Now southern Iraq, Sumer was the earliest known civilization in Mesopotamia. The city in which this prologue takes place is Akkad, the capital city of the Akkadian Empire. Considered by many to be the pioneers of civilization as we know it, the Sumerians were very innovative when it came to language and architecture. This is seen throughout the game by the temples and statues. We learn in the prologue that Naram-Sin, the king of the Akkadian Empire, sacked a temple in Nippur and a plague and famine came. But what caused this? Well, according to the mythology, it goes a little something like this. After years of praying to the gods, Naram-Sin grew tired of not being answered, so he decided to bring the gods to account. He set his sights on Nippur, the special seat of the god King Enlil, who was one of the chief gods and, rather importantly, the father of the moon god Sin. Nippur was also considered to be a sacred city, a holy city. Naram-Sin decided to sack the temple of Enlil, a temple called Ikur. After Naram-Sin's army had sacked Enlil's temple, which was considered a blasphemy, Sin, the moon god, along with 7 other gods, decided that Akkad should be destroyed in order to spare the rest of Sumer and cursed Akkad. Sin then sent an army, a mountain tribe called Gutians, to attack Akkad, releasing its livestock and destroying its farms in order to curse its people with famine and plague. Naram-Sin and the Akkadians believed that the Gutians were demons sent by the moon god Sin, and that they were responsible for bringing the curse upon their land. Believing that this curse came due to the sacking of the temple, Naram-Sin built a new one as a way of seeking forgiveness from the gods, which is why the statue on the temple is praying up to the skies. Little did he know that he'd actually built his temple upon a crash-landed alien ship, but we'll get to that soon. The Akkadians sacrificed thousands of people in the name of their gods, desperate to lift the curse of famine and plague from their lands and threw the bodies into charnel pits. So we find out in the game that a dig, or an expedition, was down in the temple in 1946. All their equipment was left behind, which suggests that none of them made it out. We find diary entries which give us a great idea of what happened. On September 24, 1945, archaeologist Randolph Hodgson and his wife Mary, newly married, met with a wealthy antiquarian Lady Bradshaw who wanted to fund an expedition. Mary noticed Lady Bradshaw's brooch, an ancient Sumerian relic from Iraq. Directing them to another relic from the site, a gold cuneiform tablet, she called it the final puzzle piece in her life's work. She said it was a map which gives the location of the tomb of Alexander the Great, located on the border of Iraq in the Zagros Mountains. On April 2nd, 1946, they had assembled their team, which consisted of Captain Sherman Crow, an old war buddy of Randolph's, who recommended an experienced dig foreman named Arthur Pullman, along with Randolph's assistant, Aline Junot. Lady Bradshaw wanted her own advisor there, so she wanted Ellis Van Hoyten, an archaeologist with a very bad reputation. Later that year, in October, they managed to break into the tomb, along with their hired help of people referred to as the Fellahin, which was the name for a peasant in Arab countries. It's noted that the Fellahin felt comforted by the huge machine gun which Captain Crow brought along, as these people knew the legends behind the temple. A note even states that they had trouble hiring workers for the dig due to their fear, even turning down more money. They discover that the temple is that of Naram-Sin, the Akkadian god king. Lady Bradshaw still declared it a great find, one for the ages, so to speak. Randolph mentions that his assistant Aline has worked on digs with large amounts of death involved, but never on the scale that exists in the temple, as the Akkadians sacrificed thousands of people to appease their gods and dumped their bodies in pits. A couple of months later, Randolph goes to celebrate their finds with some champagne, but Mary has found Lady Bradshaw's box of dynamite. She is concerned about the use of dynamite in a dig site due to cave-ins, etc. Crow then arrives and grabs the dynamite, stating that they found something down below. Upon going down there, Randolph mentions the stench of death, and that there were corpses everywhere. And Crow deduced that this was likely the work of local bandits, tossing their victims down there from the surface after robbing and killing them. But the real reason Crow brought them down there was a strange light emanating from somewhere. Bradshaw then nodded to Crow, who opened the dynamite. Blowing a hole in the wall, they stumbled on what appeared to be an old city. They set up an elevator to allow them to go down to the depths. A week later, they went down. They found a sleeping city, and they came across cocoons. For the next few weeks, they studied this city, and now this is where it all goes wrong. Crow finds Mary unconscious in the star chamber and lays her down in one of the cells. Lady Bradshaw questioned Mary, who seems to be dodging Lady Bradshaw's questions. Days later, Pullman finds that the radio has been sabotaged, and Randolph considers the fact that someone wants to stop them contacting the outside world. He goes on to harbour his doubts about Ellis Van Hoyten. Mary's condition gets worse, and Randolph finds Lady Bradshaw asking Mary more questions. Mary mentions winged demons, and Lady Bradshaw's eyes lit up. Mary lashed out and grabbed Lady Bradshaw's brooch, clawing at her chest. Mary dies the day after, but not before she makes Randolph swear to bury the place so no one else can ever find it. Later that evening, Randolph notices the brooch Mary snatched from Lady Bradshaw. On it was the image of something which resembled the creatures they'd been studying from the cocoons. He realises something horrifying, that Lady Bradshaw knew all along that these demons existed, and that they'd find them down there. Mary then reanimates and tries to grab him from behind the cell bars. At this point, workers have gone missing, and Lady Bradshaw has gone down to the city below. Randolph mentions that Bradshaw wants to become one of the creatures, bizarrely. Whoever was sabotaging equipment has sealed the team in there with the creatures. Randolph decides that honouring what Mary asked, to bury the place, is what they need to do, so he sets about placing dynamite on the pillars in the temple. Randolph finds Lady Bradshaw down below, and finds her sucking the blood from her assistant Ellis Van Hoyten's corpse. Randolph sees that she has changed just like Mary did. He stakes Lady Bradshaw through the heart, killing her. At that moment, the blood spilled and the creatures let out a shriek. Randolph then appears to shoot himself and his account ends. But who sabotaged the equipment? Who blew the temple so the team was trapped in there? Well, whilst in the Star Chamber, Rachel finds a note written by Ellis Van Hoyten, which states that he is the saboteur. He sabotaged the dynamite and the radio in order to prevent the sealing of the temple, in order that humanity could study these creatures and learn about them. Judging from an expedition map, it seems that Lady Bradshaw and Van Hoyten even went as far as creating a fake dig site location. Therefore, nobody even knew the expedition was there until years later in 2003, when the soldiers fell down there. It's possible they also did this though, to deter grave robbers. So it seems that a big part of this game revolves around the archaeological dig. The archaeologists also believe that the temple which Naram-Sin built was built on top of the 7 gates of the underworld which existed inside the Zagros Mountains. Let's look at the antagonists of this game, the creatures. Vampires, bats, or whatever you want to call them. Way back when, due to their advances in astronomy, the Sumerians often detailed constellations of stars on clay tablets, much like this one. This one in particular shows a constellation known as Cetus, known as the Whale. One of the archaeologists, Mary, believed that the contraption in the star chamber represented this constellation. Anyway, in the game, Jason and Salim, who were later joined by the others, ventured 3,500 feet down into what seemed to be a green abyss. Down there, they find a lot, and I mean a lot, of cocoons. Salim mentions that the fluid in these cocoons smells similar to formaldehyde, a preserving agent. This is seen better when they come across the corpse of Balathu, or Kurum, depending on how your prologue played out, still alive despite missing half a head. It was essentially preserving flesh. These creatures hibernated inside the cocoons, which allowed them to stay alive for thousands of years. The moment they smell fresh blood, they begin to come out of hibernation. But where did they come from in the first place? It appears from a vision Rachel had whilst infected with the parasite that they arrived on Earth from the constellation Cetus, and potentially crash landed onto Earth at some point, although we don't know when exactly. Over the years, stories were told of creatures named Galu coming out at night and dragging mortals into the underworld. Could the legend of Galu come from these creatures? It seems that people worship the creatures, and we see some kind of effigy in the huts on the farm, suggesting that the shepherds pray to the creatures. It seems as well that these shepherds had tons of gas masks, but this makes total sense when you refer to a couple of documents in the game. First, this one details infection symptoms. It appears that exposure to the creatures could cause sickness, and this also explains why Mary got so sick. The second is a document which contains details about the black saliva of the creatures. This saliva was reported to emit a stench which caused a sensation similar to that of mushrooms. Psilocybin, or the magic mushroom compound. Anyway, they use respirators to minimize the effects. We also see reports of bandit attacks around that area, one of which states that an aid worker called Marie Vinay went missing, presumably being robbed and killed. It seems that after finding Marie Vinay's ID card in the pit, it's revealed that the bandits threw their victims down into the temple, possibly even as a sacrifice to that which they worshipped, the creatures, hence all the blood and bodies down there. We find a note by one of the archaeologists, Mary, who speculates that these creatures could have even come to Earth millions of years ago, way before the Sumerian civilizations were established. This could have influenced the legend of Pazuzu, the winged idol. Pazuzu certainly seems to resemble these creatures in some way, and not the other way around. It mentions that the creatures respond to or communicate with music, and are potentially alien life forms. She mentions in the last sentence that it's possible they were just trying to get home. Their existence is expanded further somewhat when Jason finds remains of the two creatures that appeared to have been fighting each other. But why were they fighting? Well, it seems that these alien creatures were host to an alien parasite that had, let's just say, vampiric properties. The creatures would infect a victim with the parasite, in this case a human, and the human would turn into this. That explains why Joey and Clarice turned. They don't fully change into the creatures, it's almost like they're a mutation, a mix between the creatures and humans. This exact same thing happened to the dig team in 1946. A document shows us how they hunt, through echolocation similar to bats. They drink blood, again similar to vampire bats. They are hard to kill through inflicting physical damage such as shooting them, but they are susceptible to UV light. Their cycle, looking at this document here, is that the creatures are awoken from their hibernation by the smell or the sense of fresh blood. They then get adrenaline from feeding off the fear of their victims. They infect the victim, implanting the parasite then develops, the host dies, and then the parasite takes over, leading to this. It's likely that the creatures came up from the underworld into the temple due to the amount of fresh blood spilled on the ground, awakening from their slumber. The eclipse happening was a result of bad timing. Naram-Sin being sat in the sunlight would have protected him from the creatures, but when the eclipse took away the sunlight, the creatures managed to kill him. We see a cool little part of the game as part of a flashback, which shows us that just after their wedding in the year 2000, Eric and Rachel drive through and stop at the diner in Little Hope. Rachel mentions that a strange man was in the diner who looked at her and said, "You'll never be as happy again as you are now." Confused by this, Rachel drives away. Eric has foolishly got his feet on the dash, and a road accident causes Eric to lose his leg. But who was the man in the diner? It's possible that it could have either been Vince mourning the death of Tanya or Anthony. Either way, it's a very cool link for the two games to have. But anyway, that is it for this video. If you did enjoy it, please leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel to support, and leave a comment down below on your thoughts on this game. But for now guys, take care and I'll see you in the next one.